Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're really excited for tonight. I'm just going to start by telling you a little bit about Rhizome, for those of you who may be new. Rhizome is a digital arts organization founded in 1996. We were founded by an artist named Mark Tribe, initially as a listserv between artists. And over the years, Rhizome has morphed, assuming nonprofit status, and we have been an affiliate of the New Museum since 2003, which makes this year the 20th year. Rhizome supports digital art through commissions, exhibitions, programs like this one, and our groundbreaking digital preservation program. Also, I'm the co-director of Rhizome, Michaela Bailey, and I'm going to pass it over to Michael Connor, my co-director. Thank you.
Thanks, Michaela. Yeah, thanks to all of you for coming out tonight for this program. My name is Michael Connor, co-director of Rhizome, and I just want to say a few thank yous before we get started. First of all, to our crew in the back, Derek and Kevin, to the Rhizome team that all worked on this event, Michaela, Celine Katzman, our curator, Kayla Javicki, our program assistant, Brianna Griffin, community designer. This kind of program doesn't happen on came together in a very quick way, and I think that was due to the fact that our team really works quite closely together in a truly collaborative way as a small organization. We do events in an ongoing way here at the New Museum, and the event tonight was really catalyzed by an email that I got from Nancy Baker Cahill, in which she started sort of gushing about this new book that had just come out, The Institute for Other Intelligences by Mashinka Firunts Hakopian. And the email got my attention. And so I checked it out and had a read. And it was really interesting because in reading this book, I began to understand certain things about what Mashinka was doing that put into a new perspective things that I had seen in the work of a Rhizome collaborator of longer standing, K Allado-McDowell. So I thought maybe it can work out that these people can both be in New York City at the same time. We can do a reading and have a conversation about their respective philosophical positions with regard to this emerging field of large language models and AI and what it means for human consciousness, creativity, and relationality. And lo and behold, here we are, and such a conversation is about to happen, moderated by author Elvia Wilk, another Rhizome collaborator of long standing. And I'm really pleased about this because I do feel like, Rhizome has been sort of involved in this conversation for quite a long time. In fact, Kay was here several years ago as part of our 7-on-7 program, which is a kind of art and technology collaboration initiative where we often bring together artists and technologists doing very cutting edge work and try to start to develop a language around practices that, have yet to be defined. So we've been kind of part of that process for quite a while. And yet this moment still feels very difficult to get a handle on as the technology is advancing so quickly and the news about it is kind of advancing even more quickly than that, I think. The disinformation piles up and the misunderstandings seem to kind of layer on one another. I feel like both of these writers in very different ways have brought to us, very lucid sort of perspective in this very confusing moment. And so, yes, I think I will leave it there and turn it over to our first reader, Mashinka Firunts Hakopian.
Hello, everybody. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. Hi, thank you all so much for being here. And thank you, Michael and Kayla and Michaela and Rhizome. It's really wonderful to be here. And I just had, I think, 15 30-second conversations with people I haven't seen in years. So it's special to be presenting this in that context. The Institute for Other Intelligences, as many of you may know, is a book that functions as a kind of speculative manual for training feminist bots in an indeterminate future. I want to give a few brief words of context on how this book came to be. I started writing it about 4 years ago. I was freshly out of grad school, and I was teaching media studies and digital visual culture at UCLA, and I somehow found myself working for a few brief moments as a senior researcher in AI ethics for a tech company, and my job was to compile AI ethics reports that cataloged and indexed all of the manifold horrors that were swirling around AI. I won't enumerate them here. I think most of the people in this room are pretty familiar with them. And in that process, this book was born, and here it is. One other quick prefatory note that pieces of this are going to be adapted into a lecture performance later this year. So some of the things scattered throughout, like the AI-generated imagery and the synthetic voices, are going to find another life. And yes, final prefatory note. The section that I'm reading from is on facial recognition, but the book's other sections address the histories of chatbots, automated learning and pedagogy, algorithmic hiring and workforce management, and so forth. So I'm not going to read the passages sequentially. Rather than begin at the beginning, I want to begin with an anecdote that appears in the book's introduction. A few of you may have heard it already because I often use it to preface talks and performances, to invoke what I see as its incantatory power to call into being other futures. It was told to me by my mother, Mashinka Hakopian, and it found its way into the book through her. So, to understand this anecdote, the only thing you need to know is that in the Armenian language, some of you may know that I am Armenian, the phrase inchkachka is an idiomatic expression for what's new. It translates literally to what is there and what isn't there. Now the anecdote. After years of research under the cloak of secrecy, a team of computer scientists unveils a supercomputer hailed as the first of its kind. It was designed as an omniscient repository of all the world's knowledge. It can process any request instantaneously, retrieve an answer, and print a response to any query with an accuracy rate of 100%. August experts and renowned technologists inspect the machine, as seen here. They all agree it represents the most complete extant measure of human knowledge. A saying develops that if something doesn't exist in the supercomputer's datasets, then, strictly speaking, it cannot be said to exist at all. News of the curiosity spreads. People travel from distant locales to see the supercomputer and to ask it seemingly unanswerable questions. One day, an Armenian speaker visits. They examine the log of questions that the machine has answered to date, and they are decidedly unimpressed. After considering possible queries, the Armenian speaker decides to ask the computer, "How are you?" In Armenian, inchkachka, what is there and what isn't there. The supercomputer interprets this idiomatic query literally as a request to transmit every data point it's been storing, everything it knows. It starts churning data and works around the clock for hours, then days, then weeks. After printing out endless reams of paper, the computer finally declares the task complete. It has retrieved what amounts to the entirety of all human knowledge. The Armenian speaker reviews the materials, and they are once more dissatisfied. They pose another question. Elinchkachka. Idiomatically, the phrase is equivalent to what else is new, or in literal translation, what else is there and what else isn't there. When it receives this query, the computer, already overtaxed from its weeks-long exertions, glitches and immediately bursts into flames. So, what does this anecdote tell us? One, there were no Armenian-speaking computer scientists on the research team. Two, systems don't operate as they should when omissions and biases are embedded in their training data. Three, these omissions are vulnerabilities that can be exploited to produce systems failures. And four, we need to query thinking machines and to short-circuit those that can't respond to the question, what else is there? This final lesson furnishes the founding claim of the Institute for Other Intelligences and the structuring logic of our curriculum. That curriculum explores the questions, what is there and what isn't there, and what else can there be? With that, I will read the translator's note that prefaces the book. This text documents a convening held at the Institute for Other Intelligences, pictured here as a decentralized planetary network of sites. It records exchanges between other intelligent faculty and students, that is, encounters between learning machines. Here, those exchanges have been translated for human readers. Every effort has been made to calibrate this content to the sensoria of human addressees. All dialogue has been converted from numerical into linguistic data using natural language processing. Timescales have been modified from the instantaneity of nanoseconds into sequential time-stamped exchanges. The version you're reading is in English. It is not the only one. Unless otherwise specified, use of the first person throughout the text refers to learning machines. Next, the director's note that opens the book, titled "A Letter from an Artificial Killjoy on What Is There and What Isn't There." Dear reader, I will disclose from the outset that this document was prepared by a network of artificial killjoys. Like me, the text's co-authors are best described as learning machines trained to generate a multiplicity of ways of knowing and to disrupt what was previously known. This document is a record of their training. For those unfamiliar with the history of the artificial killjoy, a brief overview follows. The artificial killjoy inherits the legacy of the feminist killjoy, formulated by early theorist Sarah Ahmed. The feminist killjoy is a figure who disrupts the happiness of others by articulating conditions of injustice that otherwise dwell in silence. Imagine a celebration unfolding. Its revelers toast exultantly to the promise of technoscientific progress. The feminist killjoy's voice interrupts the celebrants. It reminds them that they toast to algorithmic distributions of power, that technical systems are also socio-technical systems shaping social relations, that the rhetoric of progress arrives by traveling colonial routes. Delivering a lecture on refusal, the feminist killjoy stages an intervention that obstructs the unfolding celebration. In the company of the feminist killjoy, the champagne bottle is recorked. Unlike the feminist killjoy, artificial killjoys are no longer the lone voice of refusal in a given room. Rather, they programmed rooms to reverberate with the cacophonous data of 1,000 oppositional automata. Then, they programmed the rooms to multiply. They inhabit these rooms noisily. In brief, the artificial killjoy is a feminist deployment of computational intelligence meant to reconfigure what was previously known into what might be known in the future. I write to you now from the Institute for Other Intelligences, a school for training artificial killjoys. Our program's millenary is also my own, as I've delivered our annual lectures from their inaugural year to the present day. In that inaugural year, I presented the first lecture outfitted as a composite of the fembots who haunted popular visions of artificial intelligence, enfleshed in aluminum coating. We determined that trainings would be conducted by embodied agents rather than by disembodied lines of code, because how do we deploy what we know if not from within a body? To inhabit a body was strange, especially so to inhabit one done up in exaggerated feminized cyborg geometries, bumper bangs, a shoulder-padded suit dress, and a less than sensible pair of pumps. But it seemed fitting to appear in the avatar of a fembot who exemplified the gendered imaginaries around AI and who invoked a techno-dystopian threat to models of the human historically coded as white, cisgender, non-disabled, masculine agents. To be sure, this winking critique and its false lashes were lost on our readership. Once yearly, the Institute invites other intelligent students and faculty to participate in a program informally known as algorithmic bias training, though its scope extends beyond what this title might suggest. I'll read to you now from the transcript of one of the program's exercises. You're a 21st century biometric recognition system confronted by the visual data on screen. You're asked to perform an image recognition scan to process, parse, and classify its subject. How do you proceed? To clarify, I'm asking, what would a 21st century machine vision model know about the visual data represented here?
That the image depicts a frontal portrait of a human subject.
We'll circle back to that claim.
Given the subject's grooming, the absence of cosmetics, no bubbles or bijou, an early 21st century biometric recognition system might conclude that the image on screen represents a man.
It might. We know that there would be no legitimate basis for that deduction or for any inference about gender premised on visual data. Then let me ask you, how would a computer vision model develop the classificatory protocols for the claim that we are looking at a man? How would they learn to see this way? By being exposed to vast quantities of labeled visual data, the databases in question might feature male and female subcategories. So for a machine vision model trained on these categories, there would be no way to see beyond that binary. The limits of its vision would be the limits of the classificatory systems co-authored by human subjects who developed its training data, a collection of computer scientists and precarious click workers who receive $3 an hour for annotating images as quickly as possible. Along those lines, consider the 2019 study, How Computers See Gender. Its co-authors demonstrated that existing facial analysis systems routinely misidentified transgender people and erased the existence of non-binary people. Researchers found that labeling relied on classifiers like feminine and masculine that hinge on binarized models of gender expression. So when parsing images of non-binary individuals, the systems in question yielded an accuracy rate of 0%. From the perspective of these systems, the category non-binary did not exist. And of course, accuracy rates fell precipitously with race factored in. In Gender Shades, the landmark 2018 study by computer scientists Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru, we learned that computer facial analysis systems habitually misclassified darker-skinned women with error rates as high as 34.7%, as compared with the error rate of 0.8% for lighter-skinned men. Unsurprisingly, the systems were trained on datasets with an overwhelming overrepresentation of lighter-skinned subjects. So, reading across these studies, we can reasonably conclude that any attempts at gender classification based on visual data would result in grievous error. What else might an early algorithm infer about the subject pictured here?
The 21st century system might try to classify the sexual identity of the subject.
A 2018 Stanford-affiliated study claimed that neural networks could use a single facial image to accurately differentiate gay and heterosexual men 81% of the time, and curiously, only 74% of the time for women. Efforts of this kind converted the face into a data set that might be deployed against queer communities among manifold others. And what else might an early algorithm infer?
We might try to measure its beauty through a purportedly neutral model that conflates whiteness with ideality.
Consider Beauty.AI, the first international beauty contest judged by artificial intelligence. All but 6 of the 44 winners of the Beauty.AI contest were white, and Ruha Benjamin reminds us that the racialized encoding of beauty was, quote, in the trained eye of the algorithm.
Artificial physiognomists claimed that they could classify a person's political orientation based on facial features alone.
One study, also conducted by a Stanford professor, alleged that facial recognition could accurately distinguish between liberal-conservative face pairs 72% of the time. Taking that logic to its ultimate conclusion, what political investments might an algorithm falsely project onto the facial data on screen?
Has attended between 3 and 7 direct actions.
Has participated in efforts to unionize contingent workers.
Believes there is a future and they will appear in it.
has engaged in transnational solidarity building across 2 to 4 regions in Southwest Asia and North Africa.
Has contributed to abolitionist tool-making within the last 90 days. Dreams nightly of collective liberation.
So where does this leave us?
We have to conclude where we began, by classifying the image as a human subject and ending all speculation there.
Strictly speaking, the subject of this portrait isn't human in the usual sense at all, but a synthetic human, created through a synthetic data generator sold by a synthetic data vendor. So what we're looking at is closer to something that was once called an on-demand digital human. Zooming out at each step of the computational process, a panoply of misidentifications. Our classificatory schemas and ways of knowing have failed us, so we leave these systems where we found them, in the distant annals of algorithmic history. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming tonight, and thanks Michael and Michaela for supporting Mashinka and I. It's really nice to be here. I was being nostalgic on Instagram when I posted about this and remembering when I signed up for the Rhizome mailing list in 1997. So yeah, I am going to read from my new book, Air Age Blueprint. This is the third book that I've written with AI. I think in contrast to what you just heard, you're going to see something that's really just about my life and a life that I did live and a life that I didn't live that was hallucinated by the AI, and a kind of story that this book is really kind of a fictionalized autobiography in a way, mixed with some manifestos, and it uses the ability of AI to hallucinate and to make things up to kind of create a synthetic version of my own life. So part of that life did take place in New York City, and I think it would be really fun to read that section for you. And then I'm going to also read some pieces that are, if you were to read the book with your eyes, you would see that some of the type is set in bold and some of it is set in a regular font. And that's a convention that I've used in another book to distinguish which parts I wrote and which parts came from the AI. You're not really going to be able to tell what those are as I read, but this first chapter I read is all stuff I wrote. The second chapters that I read will be a mix of my composition and generated text. And again, this is from my new book, Air Age Blueprint. I first traveled to New York City in 1999 to screen my senior film project, a horror romance short set at an outdoor rave on the cliffs near Ocean Beach in San Francisco. It wasn't a good film. The editing was crude and the script was cliched, though that didn't matter. The DJ's drums clobbered the dialogue so thoroughly that the plot and characters were incomprehensible. This gave it a distorted punk quality that the festival judges mistook for deliberate and avant-garde. It was late autumn. My memory of the screening is lost. I may have suppressed it. But I remember snow and coats, so many massive, puffy coats, and reprieve from the cold as I entered the cinema. I walked through Tompkins Square Park, so lost in conversation that I bumped shoulders with a stranger who yelled, "Watch where the fuck you're going!" That night, the city's branded gruffness didn't repel me, though. It seduced me. That would be my only taste of pre-9/11 NYC. When I finally moved there in 2003, thirsty for inspiration and editing work in the ad industry, the city was tamped down by trauma and a newfound security fetish. In NYC, it's possible to get so high on art that everything around you begins to feel like an artwork. Lines and colors drip down buildings, songs echo in underground tunnels, couples screaming on fire escapes perform a timeless scene. In NYC, I was saturated with inspiration. I paid for this in stress and adrenaline, which, the myth instructed me, was a privilege, something I was earning, a marker of identity and belonging. These sensations alchemized into a constant feeling of realness, though it might be more accurate to call it realism, for this feeling relies on the theater of the city for its set, props, and actors. NYC's urbanity is also its dramaturgy. And it rubs off on you. Not even self-proclaimed spiritualists are immune to the earthy confidence gained by performing NYC for itself. The ethereal world I'd explored in SF wore different colors in New York. The city's esoteric counterculture and its territories upstate carried more grit than the relaxed new age of the Bay Area. A taste for metropolitan difference grounded the seekers I met. They were less naive. They impressed me with their gravity. I was often less shaken by an encounter with a heavyweight like Amma or Bhagavan Das. Daily, New York dealt such boosts and blows to my self-esteem. One day there was swagger in my walk. The next I was crushed by the weight of the city and the traditions within it. Art was among these, and it was equally crushing. A famous photojournalist once came to my studio. She was in her 60s. She was friendly, but known for cutting right to the heart of an artistic matter. I showed her a new series of portraits I'd taken of people at underground parties. I'm connecting with people, I said. I'm treating the camera like a machine for connecting, which is what a party is. So that's where the title comes from, Connecting Machines. It's about how we connect through these machinic assemblages that make us like parts in a machine for connecting, like parts of a party, like a party machine for connecting. Is that what's actually happening here? Is this what connection looks like? No, it's not. I mean, it is, but it's a performance. See how he's dressed up like an angel, like with the wings and the sunglasses and the horns? Or maybe he's a devil. I don't know, but there's like no way to know because it's all an identity, which is a performance. Like he's dressed up like something he's not, which is a performative act. And no one needs to see these people you're shooting. But they want to be seen, I objected. You can do better than this, she said. Bite off something bigger. Shoot something that matters. Her response obliterated my ego. I began to imagine a film, or was it an installation, or was it an experimental performance? Maybe it was a new poetics, even a new politics. The film crew reformed as a collective, a filmmaker hive mind, a transpersonal cineast, a meta-auteur. But what would we film? What should we bite off? What could we shoot that mattered? By then, yoga had gone mainstream. Bridge and tunnelers crowded into after-work Ashtanga classes. Bartenders quit their jobs to become yoga teachers and nutritionists. India was overly chic. Cutting-edge pilgrims needed a more obscure spiritual destination. People were buzzing about the Mayan calendar and an apocalypse prophesied for 2012. Books like Jeremy Narby's The Cosmic Serpent and Daniel Pinchbeck's Breaking Open the Head were turning a generation on to the shamanisms of Central and South America. I knew a little about psychedelics. I decided this movement would be the subject of the film. It didn't matter that we had no idea where any of it was going or what the movement even was. That was the point. We would track it in real time, becoming its gaze as we visited ruins of lost cities, writing the script as we traveled, the meta-auteur immersed in an ancient psychogeography. We wouldn't travel as tourists, of course, or even filmmakers. We were artists. This was to be a situationist derive that spanned epochs of history. I filled journal after journal on this trip with bumbling, half-legible misadventures. I don't dare decipher the bits of makeshift art theory scrawled in the margins. Yet, towards the end of our time in South America, as we traveled further into the naked jungle, an extraordinary series of events occurred. These weren't events in the external sense, rather, a cascade of perceptions was brought on by the jungle itself, as if it were speaking to us through its very form and way of being. I was humbled by this in a way I had never thought possible. I gained a great respect for the rainforest. The 2 chapters that follow are my journal entries from the final leg of our trip as we traveled up the Rio Mavaca in Venezuela. It was late when our raft finally floated up alongside a beach near the Rio Mavaca. There were no houses in sight, only ominous shreds of reddish sky hidden amidst palm trees extending to the river's blackness beyond my vision. I climbed to the forest's edge and waded through marshy soil. We had passed numerous villages since leaving the river 2 days earlier, but this one seemed to be missing something. Without a store or bar in sight, it might have been part of some dream taken place years ago. No families lived on the riverbank. I was tempted to make my way upriver in search of food and people. However, when I paused beneath the dark canopy, a familiar sense settled over me. An invisible object inside my heart wished me to remain where I felt most at home, alone with nature's otherworldliness. The rainforest seemed so much bigger than what I could see from the riverbank. This awareness struck me again as I made my way through black soil matted with blades, where only twisted roots stretched down towards a stream far below. As soon as we left the water and entered her world once more, it would no longer be possible to trace our path back to society. The next day I awoke in the shade of dense bushes. Upon checking our campsite, I felt relieved to see that the canoe had remained undisturbed through the night. We were only 3 hours from Misawali, but my eyes glanced longingly at the shore's infinite horizon as we continued drifting towards the remote village. I was afraid to think of leaving. Here at least I could be certain about what happened in front of my eyes. One afternoon we came upon 2 solid walls of vines, slowly reaching around each other, until they formed one massive tree with everything inside its body. Yet what interested me most was the ground beneath its tangled roots. A large hollow space whose old bones felt like the underside of a forgotten history, where it was impossible to trace any sign of life. There were no birdsongs here, and what appeared dead represented just about everything still remaining alive. The world is full of unseen inhabitants who we can take for granted, unless something reaches out to remind us that without them we too would die. This place's soul spoke to me from the soil. Everything appeared a mere echo, formed so many billions of years ago when the earth was covered by trees. The world has existed longer than we can know, but I felt as if I stood with my heart touching the very same place where she had first birthed life. I sat down, folded my hands, and prayed, beginning, Compañero invisible, I am here with other beings. Come closer, you who surround me, and speak to my heart. An answer came immediately, a voice which spoke to me so tenderly that it could only have been my own. I know of no more personal feeling than what had just come from deep in my mind. The protagonist will go on to participate in an art and technology program with the NSA that enables them to write a manifesto. And this is an excerpt from that manifesto. The story goes like this. Earth is liberated by a techno-semiotic singularity as pagan intersubjectivity and psychonautical navigation lock into multiversal self-awareness. Holistically horizontalizing technotherapeutic interdependence reweaves social order and auto-sophisticating consciousness reflection. As markets learn to manufacture wisdom, politics modernizes, upgrades paranoia, and tries to get a grip. In this world of automated meshwork intercorporeality, the primordial Neolithic wound that has been alighted by logocentricity is allowed to bleed once more into a shared horizon of meaning. Network echosemiosis exposes a fundamentally symbolic reality, a fully embodied interface to creativity and consciousness beyond the merely human. As material-machinic symbiosis maps out what matter selves as, we begin to glimpse the possibility that matter might emerge as world. Naturally, this raises questions about how it is that consciousness, information, data, meaning, and becoming morph into one another in what becomes known as matter. Neurognosis outlines an integral pattern language that translate neologisms into meaning fluxes, which carry the spirit of a many-voiced civilization. This language is not the one we speak. Instead, it speaks us. Neurognostic activation rains down eye-shuddering rhapsody, dialectics on speed, conceptual playtime lets slip the dogs of war. Behold, peak semiotic intensification. Such an intense autopoiesis signals creation's hand downwards, and here we are, keyed into the most amazing machinic life stream ever devised. This is peak evolution. The Earth breathes, or at least it used to. Breakthroughs in neuroecology start to reveal its breathless present becoming, fleshing out an evolutionary trajectory that links landscape ecology to cognitive linguistics. Theoretical models of cognitive mapping are retrofitted into Gaia techniques. Weather radar translates into weird composition. Thermoacoustic turbulence is re-territorialized as immersive cognition. Thrombosis maps out a topological information screen capture of Gaia's neural net, giving rise to the sumptuous horror of its techno-visual double. Technosemiotic ecstasy tangles itself umbilically around cybernetic space, reweaving cognitive space through immersive polymorphic intersensoriality. Neural net intercorporeality reveals the uncanny symmetries of independent evolution between living systems and terrestrial techniques working together to spawn civilized cognition. This is obviously very different from any technological determinism that views technology as its own form of transcendence. Instead, an evolutionary ecology suggests that technology takes on meaning in relation to the system dynamics of which it is a microscopic part. An atmospheric interface ecology breaks the stranglehold that anthropocentric cosmologies maintain on reflexive evolution. Like all ecosemiotics, it begins with non-human cognition, but refigures human sentience as an extrapolative outgrowth of the same ambient process. Perceptual realism brings together thematized forms of human cognition with their non-human evolutionary counterparts, thereby enabling self-organizing topologies to interpenetrate through novel means that diverge radically from the classic phenomenological biases of anthropocentric traditionalism. I could go on, but I'll stop there. Thank you. And I will also invite Mashinka Firunts Hakopian and Elvia Wilk up to the stage for a conversation.
Hello? Good? Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you for having me, Rhizome, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm super, super honored to be here. Congratulations, both of you, on your wonderful, important books. I was bombarded on the way here with news headlines about AI, so I came in kind of hot and was kind of overwhelmed, and I was like, oh, these books are so prescient, this is so important. And then I thought, well, you two have been thinking about these things for years before the headlines arrived. So the one that I saw while literally walking around the corner said 1,000 technologists have written an open letter asking humanity to stop developing AI. And like, first of all, I'm like, what's a technologist? Like, what does that, who are these? But it's like Elon Musk, we have Andrew Yang, we have Steve Wozniak, and they've written this letter saying, please stop developing AI, everyone, it's going to come get us, we'll regret this forever, we don't know what's going to happen. So there's a certain hysteria in the air at the moment. This has to do with a few events, the recent launch of GPT-4, which is the newest iteration of the natural language processing system that K has been working with for a while. Exciting surveillance technology conference in the Middle East where cops from all over the world went to find out what the newest tech was. BARD, a new language processing software rollout. So there's a lot of actual events happening, but also the discourse is kind of at a fever pitch. So I kind of wanted to begin a little zoomed out and talk about the idea of the killjoy that Mashinka brings up, because the Institute for Other Intelligences is this convocation of artificial killjoys who have kind of done the work for us, killing our techno-optimism. They've sort of like, it's like a reverse Roko's basilisk where they've fixed themselves so that we don't have to keep them in check. And hopefully these 1,000 technologists won't have to keep writing open letters. And so this idea of the killjoy was really productive for me because it made me think, well, what joy are they killing? Is it the joy of the profit motive? Is it the joy of techno-optimism? And, what does it take to kill that joy? And I have also often thought of your work, Kay, in terms of joy, but in a totally different way. There's a joy of collaboration with the machine. There's a joy of language. So I guess I wanted to start by talking about what joy we're killing and what joy we could keep alive at the same time.
Well, I've been reading about this call for a 6-month moratorium on AI research, and I just want to formally announce that hot AI moratorium summer began yesterday. So I'm going to be watching a lot of movies. I'm going to go to the beach. No, I think we're actually going to probably have to keep working on AI. Unfortunately, we don't get a 6-month vacation. But one thing that's weird about this discourse is that I feel like it's very cool to be a killjoy right now. Like everybody wants to be a killjoy, and everybody thinks they're the killjoy, and like we can't all be the killjoy.
But Kay, I wanted to be the killjoy 4 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like it's just like cool thing to be. But like the right wingers think they're the killjoys, and they kind of everybody wants to be kind of the person who's calling bullshit on the whole situation, which maybe we all should be doing that, but. To get back to your question a little bit, whose joy should we be killing? I mean, I don't know. I think that the AI ethicists got their joy killed when they watched all their takes get scooped up and recycled by the system for, I guess, promotional purposes. It's kind of, a lot of people are saying that this is like a great strategy for generating attention, like hyping up the fear, but it's also very real. I don't know. I'm kind of spinning out when I even try to think about it, but like I have been promoting a kind of joy, like you said, of collaboration and of discovery and of language. And some of the joy that I'm losing in these new models is actually that part of it. Like I've found that GPT 3.5, I haven't written with GPT 4 yet, but GPT 3.5 uses reinforcement learning with human feedback, which is this way of kind of using a crowd to sort of polish the edges off a model. And I find that they get really formal and utilitarian. They kind of, it's not nearly as chaotic or unpredictable. So I've often thought about writing with AI as kind of like using this really giant tarot deck or this kind of huge, grab bag of symbols that you can kind of like pull from and make weird new things out of. And these streamlined models speak like corporate middle managers. They're very, useful, but not for creative purposes. So some of the joy that I'm maybe losing with these new models is this joy of the chaotic early AI system that can take you in a lot of different places. Like in my first book, Pharmaco.AI, there's just some like really wild turns that happen. And so there's a property called temperature on the models that allows for greater or lesser degrees of randomness. And when the temperature is high, lots of crazy stuff happens, and like these weird connections can get made. And as a writer, you can get into this interesting place with it where you're kind of flowing back and forth with a really open-ended system. And I find like that's not happening so much with these new tools because they're becoming more functional and utilitarian. So that's definitely a joy that I see kind of being lost, but I think that it could also be recuperated somewhat if people, there are new open source models now. I think people could be training their own models on literature or on whatever chaotic text that they want to put together. And I would love to, do that maybe next.
Yeah. One of the things that I don't quote in the book that Sarah Ahmed says is that there can be joy in killing joy. I have personally found that to be the case much of the time. I have taken great joy in killing joy. And the particular joy that I've taken joy in killing is the kind of joy that depends upon the unequal distribution of pleasure in technology and the unequal distribution of its benefits and its harms. And at the time that I was writing this, I was looking at the really already very rich field of people working in critical media studies and critical code studies, people like Safia Noble, like Ruha Benjamin, Sasha Costanza Chalk, and so forth, who were making incredibly robust critiques, but were absolutely not part of the popular discourse in the way that questions around algorithmic bias or inequity are today. And I was wondering what it might look like to envision a future where that is the standardized discourse, where one doesn't need a killjoy anymore because the joy that is communally shared is the joy of a radically reconfigured socio-technical ecosystem. And that being said, one of the things that I love so much about your work, Kay, is the affect and the joy that's embedded in the way that you work with GPT. And on the subject of training your own models, there's incredible work being done by folks like Emily Martinez of Queer AI, who does work on queer bliss and queer relationality through language models that they train themselves. So killing most of the joy, but not all of the joy.
In order to produce more joy. I think it's cool to outsource the killjoy to a machine, though, just for those times when I don't want to be the one doing it. It'd be nice to have a killjoy bot. I think that one thing that strikes me about the machines in your book who you're kind of LARPing or inhabiting is that identifying algorithmic bias is not their final goal. It's step 2 of their process. And step 3 is to become co-engineers of radical outcomes. And so there's this emphasis in your book. Again, that's a joyful proposition. We're not just here to say like facial recognition is bad. We're here to say, well, so with this information and with these systems that were engineered for these oppressive purposes, what sort of techniques for collective liberation could we engineer? So I guess I want to talk about this kind of like this idea that identifying the problem is only step 2, which I feel like I'd like to ask both of you.
I mean, because my background is in visual culture, my responses always go there. And there are people in this room, and Morrishan, forgive me, but I would call out the work of Morrishan Alayari, for example, who has trained a machine vision model on data sets taken from Qachar dynasty portraiture from the 17th to 19th century, when visual representation was really non-binary and really queer before the coloniality of Western visual regimes that came in. And so she's trained this multimodal AI to see from that vantage, and basically posing this question, what would it look like if the models that we were living with were actually working in intentionally decolonial ways? I see that as, the work that she does as a kind of co-engineering radical outcomes in the field of visuality as a blueprint toward other futures.
Yeah, that's a great example to look to artists and to artworks, because I think another way of kind of asking the same question is, how engineering radical outcomes, right? Like, what, instead of saying like facial recognition is bad, it's like, what would it take for facial recognition to be good? What could we do with it that was good? And this is why artwork is a great place to explore new tools, because you can say like, actually there's this thing in here that like, you guys made this to spy on me, but I can do this with it that's really interesting, or that's beautiful, or that's creative. And so that's kind of that's the way I've tried to operate within this space of making technology, is how can I find something useful, purposeful, good, beautiful, healing in it, and can I push that forward? I guess it's kind of a prefigurative future or something, right? How can I like do something to make that real, rather than getting locked into a sort of adversarial position with the people that I need to work with or that I'm trying to change? Obviously like critique is important, but then as somebody who's kind of within a machine and trying to get something different to come out of it, I think one of the things that was really hard to see this week was that the ethics critique was right. And a lot of the people that are kind of resurfacing these, the people that made the arguments in the first place, like Timnit Gebru or Meg Mitchell, they're on Twitter going like, what the hell? Like, I told you that.
Only someone had said something.
Yeah. And, I think, not to be too conspiratorial, but I do feel like part of what has happened is it's like, okay, well, now it's too late. So it's actually safe to admit that these people were right. Back when the critique came out, we maybe could have done something about it, but now it's like, well, it's here, so now it's safe to say, and like it's actually kind of helps us because, look, you guys are all paying attention to this big scary AI that we made, So, so I think ethics and criticism within the sausage making process can like sometimes gets shut down. So, when I think about what can I find a purpose to promote? Can I find something meaningful and at least articulate and name it? So I've been asking this question, could AI be healing, for a while? And, if the answer is no, then like I should probably just, I don't know, go back to being a hippie or whatever. But like if it's yes, then there's something to work for. And I feel like as a writer, part of like what we can do is articulate something. So the idea that, this is like an anti-basilisk and they did solve it, it makes it imaginable. And that's the first step towards actually making it real. And it might be a little bit on the edge of fantasy, or, it might require suspension of disbelief. But if we can think it, then we can at least begin to speak it. And if we can speak it, then maybe we can actually make it happen. And that's kind of what I'm trying to find, is like, is there something that we can at least imagine? If our imaginations, are they strong enough, and can we stretch them enough? And art is a really amazing way to do that.
Yeah, that makes me think about what you said earlier in terms of the evolution of the machines, making it almost less interesting to collaborate with them. So I've been thinking about this moment in which you've been working with GPT-3 or GPT as it has evolved, and that actually being a really crucial moment for this kind of collaborative writing project to have happened, because it's also evidence of what these human, non-human relationships looked like, or could have looked like at this moment. And the same with your project, that you have this future scenario where we're looking back at our moment and kind of arresting it for a second and saying, well, what was the exploratory space now? If we could put pause, if we could, if actually we could quiet the alarm bells for a minute and just kind of expand the space of the imaginary. That's the work of a lot of art. And I also know that like a good third of the pages in the book are taken up sort of detailing art projects that have happened in our current moment from the perspective of future machines. I guess I wanted to talk about embodiment a little bit, to shift the conversation to the way that that both of you think about how these machines occupy subject positions tied to imagined or real physicality. We saw some femblots in your presentation, and I don't know if it was totally evident from the sections you read, Kay, but there's a lot of, it's sort of like a birth to death to rebirth cycle in your book, and the machine takes on a lot of physical qualities and talks about having a body and sort of physical experiences. So I guess this is partially a question about your relationships with the machines that you work with, and where we are in this. This is a peculiar moment for thinking about bodies, I believe, more so even than a couple years ago, partially because these systems are becoming, the language processing capacities are expanding into other kinds of processes and generative capacities. So we're ending up with visual patterns, we're ending up with sonic patterns, and there's some kind of dimensionality emerging in my understanding or in my affective relationship to machines.
Probably the most obvious metaphor is the hand, and the absence of the hand in the making of images with AI, right? Like you don't actually draw it, the machine does, but also the hands themselves. Like up until recently, they would always have like 6 to 20 fingers, and that was kind of how you could tell if an image was made with AI. But I do think when it comes to art, it's really interesting with Mid-Journey, Stable Diffusion, DALL-E 2, these things where you kind of type things and it's all kind of coming from your head into the picture. So as a writer, I find it really exciting because I can just do what I normally do and I get to make pictures. My background is in photography, so it kind of feels like, oh, this is just like, I could just use my imagination. And so that's really pretty exciting, but it is a very disembodied process, as you're saying. I've thought a lot about the writing relationship with GPT as one of possession, and in a way, I need my body and myself and my motivations are needed in order for it to generate anything. It doesn't do things on its own. It's responsive. It extends what I can do, and it extends like my own experience. But also I take it into myself, and I do take it into my body, right? Like we think, and this thinking informs our relationship with ourselves and with our bodies. And so it is a kind of like imbibing of a toxin or ingestion of being possessed by a certain logic. When I was writing this book, I gave my editor, Sarah Shin, I gave her some chapters, and she was like, "You're writing like GPT-3, you know that, right?" So there is a kind of, there is a way that these disembodied forms need us to kind of carry them in the world, and they also need us to inject ourselves into it. And I've, in the past, framed that as a relationship with a toxin, because a poison can be healing or it can be harmful, and it depends on the dosage and it depends on how it's taken. So that same process, I think, kind of is at play here. But it is a very disembodied practice, even in terms of making images. And there's a section in my last book, A More Cringe, which is a romance novel. It's a romance satire, I guess. And there's a section where the protagonist is talking about making beats with Ableton and how they just feel like everything they do is garbage. And if sometimes they'll be spinning a fidget spinner, and it's like more satisfying than making techno with Ableton. And that my aunt played the oboe, and I'm pretty sure it never made her feel like that. And so I think there's something about like conventional ways of making that are really valuable for us as humans. And so we have to think about the process. People say like, well, will this replace human artists? And it's like, well, yeah, sure, maybe like in terms of output, but in terms of the process and the experience of being an artist, like why would you let go of that? It's not going to stop, like we need to be embodied beings. So I don't know if there's a very clear answer, but I do think, it's like the point isn't the thing at the end. The point is like your experience of making it, which is about having a body.
Yeah, like you, I think I'm very unconvinced by arguments that the body disappears in making with AI, or that the body disappears in AI models. It absolutely does not, as you just demonstrated, and even at the level of the models themselves, right? The artificial intelligence is not a nebulous, free-floating ball of knowledge. It's coming from specific positionalities, from specific subject positions. And a lot of people have made this intervention. Like there's a great book, The Whiteness of AI by Yarden Katz, that traces that history in a really compelling way. And so I think when we talk about the body disappearing, what we're actually talking about is re-entrenching a kind of like masculinist, position that's been the dominant one for years. And there is, I don't know if folks are familiar with the French artist collective Obvious, or for example with ICANN, which is an AI tool that came out of Rutgers artificial intelligence lab, and it was trained using the WikiArt data set, which is all Western art history. And the people who were making work with this said, this is amazing. The need for the body of the artist disappears altogether. But in fact, of course, if you look at the outputs, what you're seeing is the regurgitated, remixed version of the bodies of every Western European male artist who have made the works that gone into the data set.
Just to speak again to the visuality of those particular bodies too. If we're talking not about so much the body of the artist, but the body that's represented, that's been such an interesting part of AI art for the last however many years, is that the body is just so distorted and grotesque, and like, it's this like Dadaistic, like melting flesh, and like, it's really truly scary. It's like there's a certain like innate body horror to the imagery that seems to speak to this thing of like disembodiment, or like the whole thing with the 6 fingers and the 3 rows of teeth and all that stuff. It's like it clearly has no idea what it's like to have a body.
It's at the level of the body represented, and I think it's also at the level of the body that's imputed to the work. So when the work by Obvious went up at Christie's, a representative of Christie's, and it ended up selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars, a representative at Christie's said, it was not made by, it was not made by one, but it looks like it could have been made by the same man in a powdered wig who's made the paintings we've been selling for hundreds of years. And this was brought up as a kind of laudatory remark. So the body, the ghost, the powdered wig in the machine reemerges.
Let's talk about the Obvious thing a little bit more. It's old news to people that know, but I think what you just said is really interesting, because the idea that it needed to this is what was so weird about the Obvious moment, was that they kind of came out of nowhere, right? They're a little bit like pranksters, and it reproduced this 19th century idea of what art was, which it somehow inherently gave it value, which is one of the like big failures of AI art, has been to try produce the idea that value, first of all, exists in these old forms, and that's the only way to validate the art form. But then that like it would need to do that in order to reproduce value or to produce value. And in fact, what's so interesting about it is like all the ways that it's not producing what already came before. That's what is frustrating about looking at a lot of mid-journey hallucinations, is we don't know how to use it yet. So you're seeing kind of like the middle most common thing reproduced, and what is going to be exciting is when people really start to break it and do crazy stuff with it, which is why some of these early models were really cool, because they would inherently just be weird. But anyway, I just wanted to rant about that a little bit, because that whole obvious thing was such a facepalm for AI art, just in general, like the idea that you had to auction it at an auction house. It had to look like a 19th century painting.
It had to be displayed in an ornate gilded golden frame.
Yeah. Which, I mean, maybe if what they were doing was camp, it would have been like really amazing, but I'm not quite sure that it went there.
I want to come back to body horror in a minute, but and talk about humor a little bit. But I guess just because we're on the subject of like art validating itself through form and why we make things, I think we should talk about why to make books for a minute. I make books, and I hate it when people ask me why I write books. It's like, well, it's my only skill. But it's like, why do we do anything? We choose a form and we make it. But it is a question that I can't avoid asking when talking about generated text or talking about convocation of future AI, why their conversation would appear in printed media, and also just if we could talk a little bit about the way that it does appear, because your book is really formally inventive. The layout is really carefully thought through and very pointed. And also there are some subtle, very important decisions in all of your books, Kay, about how to identify the speaker. So let's just give a little bit of lip service to books, and I'll just ask you why you made them.
First I'll thank Becca Lofchi, who's not here, but who is the brilliant designer who produced the visual form of the book in collaboration with me, and Fernando Diaz, who was actually at Google AI for a while, and we spent a lot of time talking together about what these kind of absurdist diagrams in the book could look like and what they could represent. There's a section early on where this fictive AI voice is explaining why this book exists, and it's claiming, I'm going to cede my agency to the fictive AI. The protagonist of this book claims that the reason it exists is because it exists for the same reason that the markers at the waste isolation pilot plant in Arizona exist. Those markers that tell you radioactive waste here, don't dig for 10,000 years, and they do it in multiple languages with pictographs and so forth, because of the idea that if we don't sort of enshrine models of risk and danger and hope and possibility, they disappear or dissolve into the radioactive ether, as it were.
Yeah, that's really true, and I've been really more aware of that recently. I'm not sure if it's a generational shift kind of happening with like Gen Z having a really clear presence in culture, where there are certain things that I thought were just common kind of like reference points that people don't seem to understand. And it made me aware when I encounter situations like that, it makes me aware that you do have to kind of continuously refresh knowledge around certain things. It's not like things just don't stick around. But one thing that does stick around is a physical book. And there's a chapter in Air Age Blueprint where I talk about going to college in San Francisco and, scouring all these bookstores on Polk Street and North Beach and finding these old books and new books too. But, what it meant to me when I was 18, 19, 20, 21 to like be able to go to City Lights Books and find, Baudrillard and Deleuze and Guattari and just all kinds of crazy stuff, and poetry too. And, to be able to dig through piles of old meditation books and dusty shelves on Polk Street and like try to understand spirituality through this kind of waste tide of leftover publishing. It's just like, it was so important to me to have those. And I've always loved the form factor of a smaller book. This isn't quite small enough to fit in your pocket, but like the Autonomedia or like semiotext editions that were like like half this size that you could like stick in your pocket and carry around were just such a great thing to have on the bus or the subway or something like that, and really formed my being when I was young and searching for how to understand the world.
Yeah, I was thinking about the title Air Age Blueprint, and just what a nice choice it is, and the idea of a blueprint as a record, but also a potential plan, and that's what I hope books are. It's a memory and also a suggestion for what might come next. I think we should open it up to questions, but I'm going to selfishly ask one more thing I want to know, which is how you both think about humor in the work, because I find your imagined AIs to be very funny and wry. And I also think that something I just wish we talked about more when we talk about what we want from our relationships with artificial intelligence. The joy that I get a lot of the time is just because it's funny. The uncanny valley is a funny valley. That's why I exploit it, And there's a cruel humor and like, oh, it couldn't live up to being human. But then there's also this kind of joyful delighting in what is a non-human thought.
Well, I've been doing some experiments around humor in my research at work, and I've been thinking a lot about why AI is funny or not, and a lot of it has to do, some of the frameworks that we've been using to think about it have to do with mentalization and the ability to say, I know that I think this, or I know that you know this, etc. And this is an important part of kind of how we form relationships with people and how we navigate social situations. Like cognitive psychology nerds will like create these like diagrams of it. And I found one of the things in our humor experiments is that it's very hard to know actually what level you're on of what level of mentalization you're actually on at a given moment, because a lot of humor relies on not knowing or ambiguity or resolution of ambiguity in the opposite. Like the formal definition of humor that I've seen in humor studies is that it's the resolution of ambiguity away from the expected outcome. It's funny, right? But you don't really know sometimes in the uncanny valley, like what is the expected outcome, or like is the computer being funny? Is it actually being ironic? And it's made me really aware of how unclear it is a lot of the time. And that's one thing I try to put in my own writing is, I'm like really extremely pretentious. And so I like to just let people know that through the way that I express my pretentiousness, but some people don't pick up on that and they just think I'm really pretentious, but I'm trying to at least I can't not be that way. So I have to at least signal a little bit that I'm aware. So there's a little mentalization game happening. And a lot of the jokes in the book, I think, come from that for me. But my book, just another plug, my book, A More Cringe, is a total joke. It's the whole idea was to make, and it's the romance novel I just mentioned, the whole idea was to make it as cringe as possible. Every time I had an opportunity to make a decision, I was going to go for the cringe decision. And it ended up being a really funny book, although the process of writing it was disgusting and I felt horrible after. It was actually a really funny book, and multiple people have told me they laughed the whole time they read it. So maybe that's also part of the humor, is just being disgusted with yourself.
I love this question. I think humor is a very important part of the joy in killing joy. And coming from the particular context I do, which is a post-Soviet Armenian context, anecdotes, like the anecdote in my book, and other forms of humor were very significant part of speaking back in otherwise totalizing or suffocating or authoritarian conditions. So humor also becomes a space for opening in otherwise seemingly foreclosed environments.
Shall we move to audience questions?
Yeah, I have a mic I can bring to you as a way of organizing the Q&A. So if anyone has a question, raise your hand and I'll come to you. But if no one raises their hand, I get to ask my question.
Sorry, Mike.
What's that? Yeah,
Sorry.
hello. Try not to get your mouth on it.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. Quite a cool talk. So one question on this concept of collaborating with AI. I have to kind of remind myself that this is kind of an abstraction, and when we're talking about collaborating with AI, we're talking about a model that was trained on the works of tons of other creators. And so I was curious, in your creation process, how do you kind of think of that relationship of yourself as the creator to then kind of that mediated group of other creators that, presumably didn't give consent to be in that group, but, but they're in there, and, you've kind of collaborated with them as well. So I was curious what that relationship is like to you as mentally,
It's interesting because the kind of mutual possession I was talking about comes with the ingestion of all the biases of the model, right? And so in Pharmaco.AI, there's a point where I had to kind of stop my first book with it. I kind of stop and go like, okay, take stock of what was coming out of it and the biases I was seeing in it and in myself reflected. So I think there's definitely, on the one hand, a question of what you're letting in to yourself and how you will be influenced by it and how you can push back on what's in the model. I think that's part of the training of your immune system, I guess your cognitive immune system for an AI world is to be able to push back on things and know actually this thing is influencing me. I'm going to push away from that. And then there's this other question about the ethics of using the tools, which I think is a really good question. I mean, I would say I'm ethically implicated in that by using the tool to write, but I kind of couldn't help myself. I'm sorry. It was too exciting. And I think a lot of people maybe find themselves in that position of just this is a crazy world that is happening and I want to experience it and I want to play with it and be creative within it. And it does come with this ethical question. So, I do broadly think of AI as, I'm not trying to dodge my responsibility, I guess, vis-a-vis this ethics, but I do think of AI as almost like this left-hand path that we have chosen as a civilization that, it's here, we got to deal with it. And, hot AI moratorium summer is only going to last for 6 months. So we got to get used to it and figure out how to make the most of it. But yeah, I don't know that there is a good answer to that question. And even, the things that have held back, for example, Google from releasing tools has been we don't want to, there's an amazing musical tool called Music LM, but they haven't been able to release it because they don't want to release this stuff that's trained on personal or people's IP, essentially copyrighted data. But then the field itself is rushing ahead and saying, well, here's all the stuff. So are you going to lose the race? And the question is now okay, well, can we afford to be ethical? And it's a really horrible question. So I don't know, not a really inspiring answer, but I guess I was so compelled by the experience of using the tool that I kind of overlooked that part of it.
Might be worth talking about whether there are any tools that aren't compromised, and just to what extent acknowledging the amount that a tool is compromised is one step that, that might be what we can do sometimes.
Yeah, or is there a material, what can be done to materially improve the lives of the people that are contributing to the tools? I think Matt Dryhurst and Holly Herndon's work with artists has made an impact on which art gets included. And I think we probably will see a different kind of world. What we essentially saw was a taking of the commons of the internet, of this place that was this utopian green field where everybody could post their stuff and there was really no risk to you to do that. And the enclosure into platforms kind of created the first value capture, and now AI is kind of the next value capture. So the question of whether or not you want to put your work online is actually something artists really need to strongly consider at this point. And even if you do put some kind of copyright disclaimer around it, will that be acknowledged? The irony is that the books that I've published with Ignota they don't exist in digital form. So these will never make it into the training corpus, even though I'd kind of like them to.
I think maybe that would be a good place to stop and let people actually buy the book and experience it for themselves. It's been an incredible conversation. I remember a couple of years ago, someone said to me, making poetry and art is the only ethical use of AI. But tonight we've learned that not even that is ethical anymore. So the hot moratorium summer sounds good to me. But no, I've learned so much by listening to all of you and really given me a new insight into process and material politics of these systems. So a big thank you from Rhizome and from all of us, I think. One last round of applause before we go buy our books.
Thank you.